There we go. We will record. As always, in case anyone wants to go back and review any of this. We're going to continue talking about democracy today. First, a little bit of housekeeping. Will and I are just wrapping up the syllabus and setup for the discussion sections. They will start on Friday and will be through this same Zoom link. So we're going to try to make it easy like that. That they'll all just be hosted on here by Will. Your questions for those are due tonight by 11:59 p.m. So make sure that you get in the habit of jumping on, submitting a question. It really can be anything, ideally related to our course content. I have the what the heck assignment up. If there's something that's, seemingly unrelated or something that doesn't make sense from our text. So the questions should be essentially aimed at things you think there's room for further discussion on. That is a very broad array of topics because of what we cover in this class. There is a lot that we don't get to talk about in these lecture sessions. So it's nice to have a place to be able to ask those questions, expand a little bit on what we are talking about. And it is also then going to serve as the basis for those Friday discussion sections. So we'll be happy to have your questions. Please get those in by tonight, and we should be good to go from there. Those Friday discussion sections, once again, start this Friday, continue most Fridays throughout the semester. We'll be publishing, like I said, I feel like I'm repeating myself. We'll be publishing this afternoon that full discussion schedule so that you'll be able to see what days we have those and what days are off. Things like Thanksgiving break, we won't have any class. Cool. Any questions on getting those discussion sections up and running for either Will or I?
Where can we find the place to submit the questions?
Yep, those will just be an assignment in our YO course.
Okay,
so
cool.
You should see it in there under assignments. You should also see it under modules. I tried to make it easy to find, but if you struggle to find that at all, shoot me an email or something. Let me know. We can always move that around if needed. Should be pretty easy to find on there for you.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it okay if we submit like one or two questions, not just one?
Sure. Yeah, if you have, two interrelated questions, or just two questions where you're like, I really feel like there's room to talk about these two different things, yes, that is just fine. It won't affect your grade. You don't have to submit two questions. You don't have to go over the top with this, but you are welcome to do so if you so feel. And that will remind me to open the chat and make sure I'm keeping an eye on the chat during our discussion today, because I see both of you posted those questions as well. Yeah. So yep, 1 to 2 questions should be just fine. For your sake and for the sake of like how to look at this in terms of what to put in a discussion type of question. Basically look for something, if you want it to be a good question, look for something that doesn't have a yes or no answer. If it doesn't have a yes or no answer, then it's probably a stronger discussion question. I probably won't mark down if you put yes or no questions on the submission, but that just makes it easier. There'll be more to discuss if we avoid yes or no questions. Yeah. Excellent. So jumping back into democracy here, kind of ended last class at the point of saying that there is a statistical argument against any democracy needing an informed electorate. There are, by its very nature, there are going to be people who are interested in the act of governance. There are going to be people that are interested in how government functions, not just learning about it, but knowing what's going on in government, knowing what they are voting on. So if you have a representative system, as we do in the United States, as several of these first countries that we'll be talking about in this course do, if you have a system where people vote for representation in government, there are going to be people who just by their nature decide to be interested voters. And that number very easily and quickly eclipses the total number that you would need for that population to be representative. If that population is purely simple random sampling, is there any way, though, to guarantee that those people who are interested in government are in fact a simple random sample of the whole country? Or the inverse of that, is it more likely that there are going to be small groups that are overrepresented in a democracy if you allow it to be whoever is interested directing the change that happens, right? So from this statistical model that I gave you, a standard deviation, normal curve type of model, we understand that there's easily going to be enough people interested to create that curve around some kind of opinion. You can take this as the standard opinion on any individual issue. You can take this as, who a group of people think should be elected to a specific position. You can apply this at the federal level. You can apply this at the state level. You can apply this at the local level, because even most localities are going to have enough people to vote in such a way that you could have a smaller portion of that population be informed. But does that open up democracy too easily for just those interested parties to direct it in such a way that may or may not represent the wants, the needs, the desires of the public in aggregate? Thoughts?
I think you do need an informed electorate because I don't have the studies offhand, but there's a lot of research to suggest that people will vote for on a ballot list, whoever's on the top, they tend to get more votes purely because they're on the top. And I've experienced that myself, in the primaries last month, voting for committee men and committee women who are at the very bottom of the ballot. I did no research on, and I was basically going on LinkedIn and finding out if these people are actually somewhat qualified, because I had no clue who these people were. But realistically, most people wouldn't go through that hassle. They would either make a random guess or pick whatever name they think sounds best, something like that.
Right? It leaves a lot open to just kind of random chance. And that is if the system is in fact random. That's a big assumption. Thinking that a ballot that is created, for instance, is randomly listed. Most ballots should be. We adopted what's known as the Australian balloting system. And so the ballots that you see in the United States, if you walk into a polling place and go in the little curtain area, or if you get that mailed to you, in a mailer envelope to send back, those ballots probably should list the candidates in a random order, right? If you were playing into this, playing into what we know of democracy and the number of people who vote who may not be informed, because as Reese said, it's hard to get informed, right? It's been, 2000 plus years since the democracies of ancient Greece and Rome, and yet we still haven't solved this problem of being informed about politicians is still a luxury. It's still something that you have to go out and make that effort yourself to find it. There are, especially in local elections, that gets even harder. If you, happen to live in a place where there is a League of Women Voters or, another local organization that will create an actual, like a magazine with information about the candidates, that makes you fairly lucky in local politics. Most localities don't have that. Most municipalities don't have that information available in a, a fairly unbiased, factual kind of way. You get what you get from the candidates. You get maybe name recognition. That's the reason that so many local candidates especially think that yard signs are an effective way of campaigning, because the yard sign isn't actually telling you anything about their politics. It may tell you their political party, if they're allowed to have, partisan local elections. But otherwise, what does the yard sign tell you? It tells you their name. And they are hoping, by putting those yard signs out there, that if they have enough name recognition, that when you, Reese, I'm picking on you since you volunteered that information, when Reese walks into that ballot box and then looks at it and says, oh, well, all right, here are 6 candidates. I'm lazy, so I'm only going to read the first 3. And out of those, I only recognize 2 names. Well, then Reese's Choice really easily just went from 6 people down to 2. And that is effective. That is not a bad thing necessarily, because if you do those ballots randomly enough, then it's going to balance out. The people who did go out and read that information, seek out which candidate they want to vote for, or maybe in an even more idealistic version of local politics, might actually know the people running, which is the goal of, local councils, is that, you will vote for the people that you know, and they will represent you in that. But that is a very idealized version of trying to get people to vote. Rowan, I have one more thing I want to mention, and then I'll get to your question. Thinking in these terms, there's one more thing to help you on most ballots. And that's something I've already mentioned, but that's political parties. Right? Political parties, among other functions, and again, we could teach an entire, I have in fact taught entire classes on political parties. Like, I'm not going to tell you everything you need to know about political parties today, but political parties, in one of their functions, serve as a cheat sheet. They serve for voters to be able to walk into a poll, be able to walk into, most of the times, your local elementary school, go to vote, look at this sheet and see a bunch of names for the first time, never having looked them up at all. And yet there's a small d or a small r or a small I or a small G or any of the other parties, an L, there's a small letter next to their name that is intended to give you some kind of indication as to what politics they might endorse. These are not perfect, obviously. You have a lot of variety, especially in our overtly two-party system. You have a lot of variety in what a D or an R might mean, but it gives you a very broad general idea of what those candidates might be representing. And it also ties into this idea of identity politics, right? Each of you, most likely somewhere in the recesses of your mind, identifies more with one party or the other. You know, you might secretly be like, dang, I wish the libertarians would actually get somewhere because I would much more identify with the libertarians, right? I don't know what your individual political beliefs are, and that's fine. But you have some kind of identity with one of the major political parties. Most people will identify as either a Democrat or a Republican. So connecting those two things, taking that political party, walking in blind to a ballot box, and then being able to vote, because at least you have a little indication of what each of those candidates is. That suffices for some degree of education. That suffices to inform you somewhat on what you are voting for. And again, that's in most states in the United States. And we're starting off with the United States because it's a little more familiar, I imagine, to most of you, having probably taken or are taking right now, or might take very soon, POLS 1000, the Intro to American and Wyoming Government course that the university requires, because of a bunch of laws that were written like 140 years ago that say all land grant institutions have to teach Wyoming. They have to teach both the Wyoming and the US Constitution. So, you know, I'm not going to do that whole class in this class either. But, you know, we'll start off with the United States just because it is the system that most students tend to be more familiar with. So we have this, you know, interesting system of political parties where, you know, maybe you're voting for the party, not even necessarily the candidate. Reese mentioned a couple of other things that influence outcomes. The order that people are placed in on the ballot has an influence, especially if people walking in are completely blind to the process. You also have the type of name that they may have. It sounds awful and dumb and really stupid, but if you are, you know, running for office and you have a last name like Justice or Judge, you are more likely to be elected to any public office than less common names. This is, again, a huge problem that we run into in political science. This is like, you know, that shouldn't have an effect, and yet it has a measurable effect that depends on individuals and the way that they just walk in and view the vote. Now, I said I would take Rowan's question first. So Rowan and then Reese.
Yeah, you already kind of more or less kind of went over what I had a question on, so never mind. I was just gonna mention, yeah, like political parties and all that stuff, but
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. All right, Reese.
That actually reminds me, I read this article a couple of years ago about how in San Francisco, candidates, because of the large Chinese speaking population, have to have their names appear in Chinese on the ballot. So they actually get quite creative in those translations where I can't remember any specific examples, but they'll use more names that reflect like some kind of virtue, honesty, trustworthiness, rather than a direct translation of their name, because their name may directly translate to something less appealing.
Yeah, and that is where we start to see these systems, you know, even using the United States as a model, which in and of itself is probably not a great idea, but using the United States as a model of this democratic voting system, we can see very easily how this quickly starts to disproportionately favor certain groups of people in the country, certain races, certain ethnicities, certain socioeconomic stati. Like, it starts to favor people just by existing. Just by, we haven't even gotten into like the difficulty of voting for people not taking days off at work. Like, not even getting to that point. There are inherent issues in a democratic system that are very difficult to address. Because, as Reese mentioned, if you're in an area in California that has, a very strong, Japanese or Chinese or Korean presence, and so you have, individuals running for office whose true names might not be in English, should you put that name on the ballot, in the language of their choosing? Should you favor English as not an official language of the United States? Because the United States doesn't actually have an officially declared language. It has a primary language, which is English, a secondary language, which is Spanish, and then a lot of other representation. So do you put it in English? Do you try to spell it out phonetically? We run into these issues, and these are all bureaucratic issues behind the scenes of the actual vote going on, and yet they present issues and they challenge our understanding of how to have an effective election in a democracy. Yeah, Jacob, and then Sydney.
So I think another thing to be aware about is with people not being informed about the specific issues that political officials are going off of. A lot of people resort to personality traits, or if the candidate is charismatic, which is not a great way, because granted, being charismatic in speeches can help, but you really need to look at the political ideas of the candidate rather than does this guy seem like a cool guy to hang out with, or does he seem personable or something like that?
Right, that George W. Bush argument. A lot of people, when George W. Bush became president, a lot of people were like, well, I don't know if he's going to be a great president, but I kind of want to grab a beer with him.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to.
Yeah. And that is powerful. That is, significant, and something that on aggregate, in mass, is hard to quantify, hard to justify. We really have to take a look at candidate by candidate, how that impacts their overall run. I think as well too, and this is always an interesting case when it comes to social media use as well. We for some time in the past, things start to blur together when you study this stuff way too much. We had an election going between a very well-seated, long-serving House of Representatives member, Anthony Pappas, who was challenged by a new up-and-coming primary Democrat, so same party, by the name of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so a lot of people thought that Anthony Pappas would win. Like, he was the incumbent for several election cycles, very strong candidate. Oftentimes we don't see someone with that kind of incumbency lose their seat. And yet, leading up to the primary, you have a very outspoken, very well-spoken new candidate coming up who knows how to engage with social media. And so, we start paying attention all of a sudden to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who seems to just have a better grasp on communicating with people, being there, present, showing, that they are able to communicate with individuals in an effective and persuasive manner, both in person and on social media. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did a lot of social media engagement. Anthony Pappas did not during the primary run. And so you have this, very stark contrast between how they're communicating. And then in the end, obviously, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ends up winning the seat, and, de-seating Anthony Pappas from that position. So there's an argument there as far as, how significant is this when it comes to, younger, more persuasive voices that can get attention, people who can use social media more effectively to campaign, or to communicate with their constituents. Is that better? Are having more conversations, having more communication in that way, especially on newer media platforms, is that an effective way to govern and represent people? All of this plays into this core conversation about this effective use of democracy. Yeah, Sydney.
I just want to say, I think it's so interesting that you highlighted like the two-party system, because I feel like that also highlights our need for like an informed electorate, because there's a lot of the times people will, like you said, vote for their like party just because they are associated with that party and not knowing any of that person's core values or their actual plan once they're in office. And I think that the whole social media age is also a super interesting thing, because we've now seen a large rise in like political influencers and a lot of people that sort of highlight candidates' main goals in office, and it informs a lot of people on who they should or should not vote for based off of what this like random social media influencer said. And so I think that's also super interesting to think about, like what our democracy will look like in 10 years from now when like social media continues to rise.
Yeah, absolutely. Rowan, I saw you.
Yeah, I was also gonna partially go off of that in a more local context, actually. As some of you may know, the local like Wyoming primaries happened about a month ago, and in Laramie specifically, the sheriff's race was kind of a little bit of a nail biter on the Republican side, because we had a guy named Rafael Delgadillo and then a guy named Joel Sr. Both of them have worked in Laramie law enforcement, but Delgadillo moved here from California 8 years ago, and then Joel Sr. has lived in Laramie his whole life. And so what ended up happening was Delgadillo got a lot of out-of-state funding, and he had all of the big signs and everything, at a ton of, really big one down on 287, just by the fireworks stand down there, if you guys have ever driven down 287 on the way down to Fort Collins. And what ended up happening, surprisingly, is that Joel Sr., the local guy, who I guess everybody in town knows, ended up beating the out-of-state funded, got Delgadillo guy by a good like 60% or something like that. And part of the reason why he was able to do that was just, alone on name recognition and, local, being just a local cop for so long and so on and so forth. So he was also able to use social media really well as compared to Delgadillo, which Delgadillo, I don't even think he had an Instagram, but Joel Sr. has Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff. So it's kind of an interesting way that it all played out, and like how social media helps prospects for sure.
Excellent. So I think both of you, both Sydney and Rowan, raised some excellent points to think about when it comes to how we implement democracy now, how we see these things playing out, beyond, just informed electorates. How familiar are our electorates with the people that end up representing them? And how much does that matter? As Sydney mentioned, people, the campaign promise side of things, not always necessarily connecting with the actual outcome of what people do once they are in office. Is that as important? Do we lend ourselves too easily to that easy button politics that I mentioned comes with, a populist approach to politicking? If we don't follow up, if we go vote, which, as I said at the end of last class, everyone should vote. Okay, it's important numerically to the system functioning. For democracy to have legitimacy, we always encourage as much voting as possible. But if that's all you do, if you just vote and then stop paying attention, until the next vote comes around. Is that democracy still functional? Is it effective? Probably less so. And that is, again, something that we always struggle with. So I don't have a slide related to this. We'll get to the next slide eventually. The flip side argument of all of this is that in the United States, we rely on having individuals vote, having individuals get enough of a buy-in to go out and do the process of voting. We hope that maybe they even do some research beforehand. They go out and find out about who they're voting for. Or they're, at least plagued by 1,000 YouTube ads leading up to every election, telling them who they should vote for. I actually found it really funny the other day I was on, this was before the primaries. The other day I was on a website, and all of a sudden I heard a familiar voice start talking to me, and an ad for Megan Degenfelder, who was running for school board, popped up. And I knew Megan. We used to hang out when she went to UW. So it was very strange to all of a sudden to see, like, scrolling on a random web page and have, Megan Degenfelder pop up and say how she should be elected to school board. That is something that is also kind of unique to the United States. Most other countries don't experience that same level of political saturation. Many countries even have laws against it. We'll talk about this a little more when we get to, like, Germany, which has, one of the most functional and stable democracies on the planet. They have laws against, like, you can't advertise on television in Germany. You can't buy ads to now you can't buy ads that air even on social media sites like YouTube. The United States obviously has never done anything to ban that or even curtail that. It has often been expanded in the US. So these little things, even in this broad umbrella of democracy, these little things still influence how we understand our interactions with democracy. So the flip side of that is, should we mandate voting? And there are certainly a number of democracies around the world that require all of their eligible voters to vote. Now, obviously, this is a little bit more of a rhetorical question. Maybe if you are interested in this, maybe raise this as one of your questions that you could discuss further on in the discussion section on Friday. But countries like Australia that have mandatory voting see a bit of a shared benefit from it. On the one hand, obviously, their voter turnout is a heck of a lot higher. Right, in a country where you have mandatory voting, your voter turnout tends to be in the 95 to 99 percentile, as opposed to the United States, where we are lucky to get 65% of our eligible voters to actually vote in an election. So from a numerical perspective, there's better representation in countries that mandate voting. And it also, we have seen in several studies that have been done on countries that mandate voting, Austria is another one. In Austria, we see a higher level of information attainment by the average voter, because it's required. And because requiring voting also means backing that promise up, right? You can't have mandatory voting and then put voting on a Tuesday where you require people to take off time from work or rush to an inconvenient location to go poll. You can't do any of that if you're mandating that people vote. All of the holidays that come with it, the ability for people to access it, widespread vote by mail, which the United States is actually a little bit behind most other developed democracies on. All of these things have also resulted in countries that mandate voting in higher levels of political information, and higher attained levels of individual knowledge when it comes to politics. So that is like I said, an interesting thing to throw out there. Odin's right. Yeah, things like Citizens United make this more difficult in the United States than in other countries. Yeah, I saw Ven, I think I saw your hand raised. I didn't want to skip that.
I was just going to ask if it would be, I mean, constitutionally, can America even limit political ads? Can you stop people from campaigning on social media within the realm of the Constitution?
You can't stop, but you could limit. It would be, I mean, obviously, someone's going to raise it as a constitutional question. You know, anything you do along those lines, yeah, somebody is going to fight it in the courts. But we have, you know, limits on the amount of money that can be spent in most cases. Gosh, I can't properly address Citizens United in 14 minutes, but Citizens United obviously made that a lot more difficult. There's a lot of ways to get around that, but you can limit the individual candidate themselves, you know, and so in the ways as far as, you know, their interactions on social media, what they would go out and do as far as advertising, buying time on television, all of that. There are things that we could do to lessen it. Now, since Citizens United, you know, the fact of major corporations still buying that time, still advertising for them, that, yes, is much harder to limit. That would likely, at this point, given that it is a Supreme Court decision, that would require an act of Congress. That act of Congress would then be challenged, would likely rise to the Supreme Court again. And so Congress might, honestly, to change it in full, we probably would need a constitutional amendment. And that's, yeah, that's, like I said, branching over into the American side of all of this. But America is a country in the world, so we still get to talk about America when it comes to comparative politics. Yeah, it's very difficult to change things like that in the United States, especially after something like a Supreme Court decision. So yeah, we would be fighting an uphill battle. And there is very little push, other than academically, there's very little push to mandate voting in the United States, or even to limit the amount of campaigning that there is. Everyone just complains about how annoying it is for like 6 months. That's another thing I like about Germany. Their elections run 6 weeks. So it's like you only have to deal with them for 6 weeks. And it's just posters up around the cities. It's beautiful, especially the Pirate Party. I always love the posters they come up with. Yeah, anyway, but yeah, you complain about it, you get to complain about it for 6 months. Hopefully you then vote. And then that has been growing, you know, with politicians like Donald Trump, who declared in 2016 that they would be running for re-election in 2020. Essentially, some politicians are attempting to expand that campaign time out to 2 years, which is just insanity. But yeah, it's just a facet of our government, and there's not a lot of push to change it. Yeah, Sydney.
So I guess I just have a question. Do you think that there is a lack of like push for mandated voting because of the two-party system and the fact that there's like a lack of representation for a large portion of like the citizens, and they won't like resonate with any of the two candidates that are going to be elected?
Sure. Yeah. There are a lot of reasons out in the literature as to why, and that is one of them, is that if you mandate voting, it almost necessitates a multi-party system, because people if you require everyone to vote and then you only give them 2 main options, they get fed up a lot faster, right? Like the people who are fed up with the 2-party system have the option of just not voting right now. If you force them to vote, they're going to make that voice heard. and they're going to vote more heavily for third parties if they feel, even if they don't feel a third party is going to win, if they can undermine the power of the two parties. So yeah, the two parties have a very vested interest in keeping a two-party system. You know, the Democrats and Republicans in the United States want to win elections. That might seem surprising as a statement that is like somewhat profound, but that's something that's not always explored in political science literature. is the simple fact that the two parties want to win elections, and they would love to win all the elections, right? If the Democrats had their way, they would win every single election and we'd have a one-party state. If the Republicans had their way, they would win every single election and we'd have a one-party state. When that is the case, you're lesser of two evils, right? Because a one-party state is by necessity going to fail eventually, especially in a place like the United States. If that is the worst outcome is either of them actually succeeding. So they accept the existence of the other party because a two-party system is still easier to win most of the time than a multi-party system would be. So yeah, the two parties, insofar as their own existence relies on it, will push against mandatory voting because it would undermine their core value of, you know, where I started this discussion of democracy. We like democracy until people who disagree with us start voting. And that's not me saying it personally. Obviously, like I support democracy in all of its flaws, but that's generally the way that we look at democratic systems. We like democracy, we like our voice to be heard until we realize that someone else who disagrees with us also gets their voice heard in democracy. And that is a constant struggle for the parties. That is something that is much more diffuse. And again, this is slight spoilers for the future discussions. Next week, we'll jump into the US and the UK, which serve as a really good counterpoint to show democracy in action, but also democracy as it changes between a presidential and a two-party system and a prime minister and monarch system, as well as a multi-party parliamentary system. So the US and the UK are really good counterpoints to continue just to explore this overall idea. But yeah, there are a lot of reasons not to, and a lot of those arguments are going to be made if there was ever a push for mandatory voting. The two parties are going to be against it, just because of their own self-interest and their own ability to continue to win elections. Yeah. So, yeah, go out and get informed. That's good. I don't know, do it because you can, maybe, hopefully you have the economic capability to continue to be informed and do research and things like that. But understand that that is one of the greatest challenges facing the United States, and there's not a whole lot being done about it. Other than, like get out the vote campaigns that really are just aimed at getting people to vote. We have to get people to vote before we can try to get them to vote in an informed way. I feel like we've gone in a really good direction with this. There was another point I wanted to make today, so I will make it quickly, though it's going to feel kind of juxtaposed given that we went really in depth on discussing this aspect of democracy. The outcome of this democratic movement around the world, for the sake of comparative politics, has resulted in a couple of difficulties in grouping countries. Because obviously, why have ideologies if we can't then put them into effect and say, okay, the United States is a liberal democratic republic? Like, if we can't apply them to countries and then group those countries and then say, okay, well, the United States has similarities to the UK and France because all three of them are democracies, right? That is effective. That is necessary for us to have a point in having all of these discussions. But if you take that too far, we run into the way that political science discussed our democracies and discussed countries for a fair part of the last maybe 50, 60, I guess 70 now years of political science. Evolving out of the Cold War, we had the first, second, and third world theories. This is probably something you might still use today, just in your everyday language. We still hear it a lot, even though it has become slightly outmoded as far as the way that we refer to groups of countries. But you can see just in this map, the first world was the democracies of the world. It was all of the democracies getting together and saying, hey, we need a way to talk about ourselves and those other guys. You can imagine that this first world theory arose out of UK and German scholarship in conjunction with the United States. It was a way of putting the democracies on top of the world, saying the democracies are the best, we're first. Cool. Then there's also those other guys, those commies on the other side of the world. So we'll call them the second world because they're still pretty developed. They have strong economies. Like, we wish they didn't, because that shows that communism can succeed. But we'll call them the second world. We'll group them into this group and just say they're still not quite the democracies that they should be, but we'll go ahead and give them some representation too. And then the third world was everyone else, everyone who didn't fall into those two categories. You can, I think, very easily see why this is a problematic way of organizing people. It's a little bit racist. It's offensive to anyone who's not in democracies. And so this lasted far longer than it probably should have, but it gave us a way of conceptualizing how we sort countries and a starting point. Nowadays, you might go into an international studies class, and the new nomenclature that we use much more frequently are developed countries and developing countries. Sometimes you might even hear underdeveloped countries. So that is a little bit more preferred today. But if I show you the map, oh, I can scroll back and forth, so I can, maybe, if it lets me. No, I don't know what's happening. All right. You can see just by looking at these two next to each other. Okay, I'm just going to leave it up. I think I'm scrolling or something. You can see by putting these next to each other that it's not all that terribly different, right? We had the collapse of the Soviet Union, so we now group the commies in with the democracies. And we've shifted a few other countries around in where they fall on this. But I think it still has a lot of the same problems that the old designations had. It's a nicer word, developed as opposed to developing. It sounds much more hopeful than just saying these are the top tier countries, these are the second tier countries, and these are the third tier countries. But it still shares a lot of those issues. Reese brings up the question in the chat, why is Greenland shown as third world while Denmark was first? Yeah, like, you gotta shove them somewhere. And Greenland at the time just had a very small, almost non-existent economy, and was, again, this was written 40 years ago. So in that first world, second world, third world, Greenland just didn't quite ascend to the level of being in the first world. They weren't considered democratic enough to qualify. So yeah, it's problematic. And I will say that the new way of talking about this is also problematic. Anytime you try to paint with this broad of a brush, it becomes an issue. So for the sake of comparative politics, where we fall on this sort of thing, this is still a little more prominently used in international studies, where it makes sense. Like, you want to be able to talk about these broad swaths of countries instead of picking each individual country and building up from there. In comparative politics, that's not quite the approach that we take. We take the approach of examining the individual country itself and how the inner workings of that country, the structure of its government, the type of people that live there, influence its interactions with other countries around the world. So even if these show up in our textbook, you know, this kind of thing, understand there's always going to be a problem with it. You know, there are a few dozen examples like Reese's of like, why, what, how is that? No, that doesn't make sense. Like, you know, Saudi Arabia being considered developed just because it has a very strong economy, even though it doesn't share any of that economy or any of its, you know, compatibility with most of the countries around it. We will talk later this semester about the difference between why you don't call people from Pakistan Arabs. That will play into exactly this and exactly why these problems exist. So that is our class for the day. Thank you so much. Submit your questions. Jump in the discussion on Friday. We will be sending out reminder announcements since it's the first week, but jump into discussion and I will see you again next week.
Thank you.
Thank
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I emailed you that updated syllabus at the
Hang on.
beginning of class. So